mode.
Hi, this is Dr. Stoller, and welcome to this webinar entitled The Biomarkers and Clinical Applications in Autistic Disorders. I will be taking questions at the end that you can type in the chat area. So without any further ado, we'll start this presentation. That's just the introductory slide, and that's me, so you know who's talking. And I'm talking to you from beautiful downtown Santa Monica, that building you see there, the New Hope Clinic. So I want to start this webinar this morning talking about mitochondrial disease, mitochondrial dysfunction, and something that I call metabolic autism. Although I have to tell you from the beginning, I don't actually like using the word autism because autism is a misnomer, and it's a term that really has been used to obfuscate a medical problem. And you might get sick of hearing me talk about that this is really a medical problem by the time this presentation is over. But that's the situation. This is an environmentally triggered encephalopathy. To a greater or lesser degree, and we need to treat it like a medical problem. And until we start treating it like a medical problem and start taking responsibility for the environmental toxins and the sources of those toxins, it is a threat to everyone on this planet. And this is not just about autistic children. This is about everyone, and the toxins that affect autistic children are affecting everyone and causing a whole plethora of degenerative diseases and cancers. So understanding what is happening to these canaries in the coal mine, understanding what's happening to the quote-unquote autistic children is important for saving everyone's life and the future of the human species on this planet. And I don't say that lightly, even though it sounds like a platitude. So we know that children on the spectrum have a wide range of mitochondrial dysfunctions, and I haven't really started talking about what is the mitochondria. The mitochondria are these little fuel cells in each one of our own cells, and they convert oxygen and sugar into the fuel ATP that our bodies run on. That's a very simplistic way of one of the main features of what the mitochondria does, and obviously we'll be talking more about the mitochondria here. But a significant portion of autistic children have impaired methylation and antioxidant detoxification capacity that results in chronic oxidative stress. We know this. This is a fact. This is part of the medical problem. It's part of everyone's problem on this planet. Now, most of the cases of children who have mitochondrial dysfunction do not actually have a genetic abnormality or a chromosomal genetic abnormality. Not all the genes, the mitochondria actually have their own DNA, so you can look at mitochondrial DNA to see if there's a genetic abnormality, but most of the genes that encode for the mitochondria are actually not in the mitochondrial DNA per se, they're in the chromosomes. But be that as it may, there are no significant number of true genetic abnormalities that are causing the problems that we're encountering with autistic disorders. And it's much like lung cancer. Lung cancer does affect people of a certain genetic phenotype, certain genetic predisposition, but lung cancer is not a genetic disorder. Toxins are coming into the lung, and some people, because of their genetic makeup, are more susceptible to get lung cancer than the next person, but they don't have a genetic abnormality because they got lung cancer. Their particular combination and expression of genes in their body made them more sensitive to the ravages and stressors that the tobacco smoke causes. And this has to do a lot with epigenetic issues. And when I say the word epigenetic, that's really referring to not the genes themselves, but the things that turn off the genes, the things that turn on the genes, the things that allow the genetic material to be expressed. So that's very important. And you can take two twins and separate them at birth and expose them to different upbringings, different nutrition, different toxins, and you can look at those same twins 30 years later and you'll have genetically completely different individuals, not because their genes have changed, but all these environmental issues have changed the way their genes were expressed. So that's what epigenetics is all about. So, well, here this slide is just what I've been talking about. Autism is not so much about genetics as it is about DNA, because it's the DNA that gets switched on and off when it gets exposed to some of these toxins. And what are the toxins? It's coming from the environment. It's coming from coal-fired power plants. It's coming from smelteries. We know that amalgam dental fillings are still the largest individual source of mercury exposure to humans on this planet. So there's so many pesticides and chemicals that we're being exposed to, and they're all causing secondary mitochondrial dysfunction, not just in autistic children, in everyone. So by becoming conscious about recognizing that autism is a medical problem and consciously and proactively treating this as a medical problem, the benefit for everyone will kaleidoscope out, and the same treatments that will help and can help and do help children with so-called autism will help everyone deal with the myriad of medical problems that we're all suffering from, because no one can live a long life anymore on this planet without being impacted by these toxins to a greater or lesser degree. And if we continue to pollute the planet, the amount of toxins will increase, and the amount of degenerative diseases and cancers and premature aging will affect all of us. And I have to fault the environmentalists for not being more proactive about connecting the dots. This is not just about pediatricians who have become unconscious, vaccine pushers, and running dogs of the pharmaceutical companies, or the psychiatrists who have hoarded this diagnosis as if it was some kind of behavioral problem for all these years. Shame on them. But there are others at fault. We're all at fault for not recognizing and not being more sounding the alarm bells that there's something seriously going on here, and demanding that the government do something about regulating and stopping the use of these poisons. So this is just one of many, many articles that are coming out indicating that environmental factors affect the emotions of children with autism, again affecting everyone. And these articles come out, and meetings get held, and the consensus now that this is an environmental problem. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm on a broken tape here. Just last month, the twin study from Stanford and the University of San Francisco came out showing that by far the vast majority of autism cases are due to environmental factors, not genetic factors. And so what are we going to do about it? What are we going to hold meetings and then walk away from the meetings and saying, yeah, we should all do something about it, and nothing gets done? We really have to become more involved in our communities, in our environment, and if that means you help stop getting your water fluoridated where you live, if you have to sue your public water system for putting in poisons like fluoride in the water. If that's what you do, then that's what that's your piece. But everyone has to do something. Everyone's saying, oh, it's the government. We're the government. Ultimately, we're the government. Understand that. So everyone has to do something, because this affects us, it affects our children, it affects our grandchildren, whether we're dealing with autism or not. Remember, autism is just the tip of the iceberg. So here's a slide that just goes through some of the major symptoms of mitochondrial dysfunction, and anyone with an autistic child will recognize some of the symptoms on this list. And we know from certain articles that there are chemicals, there are proteins and peptides that we can look for to see that there's actually something metabolic going on. And I direct your attention to the study that was done in 2008, Defects in Children with Autistic Spectrum Disorders. 65% of autism patients referred for mitochondrial evaluation to this clinic were positive for oxidative phosphorylation disorders on a muscle biopsy. Now, oxidative phosphorylation, that is the main function of the mitochondria. That is where the electrons are transferred from one entity to another in the process of creating ATP. And measuring oxidation rates of pyruvate, malate, succinate, and ATP, this is how you find out that you have a mitochondrial disease. This was done by a muscle biopsy. Muscle biopsies is not practical on everybody. We do not have to necessarily do the full 9 yards workup on everybody, including muscle biopsy, because at a certain point you just have to say, well, this is consistent with what we have discovered in children who are being affected like this, and we can look at less direct biomarkers to determine whether someone has mitochondrial dysfunction. Why should we do this? Because we can treat this. There is treatment for mitochondrial dysfunction. This study by Rosenall and Fry did a meta-analysis literature search on all the peer-reviewed databases for medical literature, and came up with some interesting conclusions. And that is that lactate pyruvate and ubiquinone, which is CoQ10, have abnormal values, and indirectly carnitine. And they're very good biomarkers of mitochondrial dysfunction. And this is the conclusion drawn from the vast majority of the medical literature. So we can look at these biomarkers and start drawing conclusions without having to put children through muscle biopsies, without having to look at mitochondrial whole genome analysis, which are tests that are thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And that money is better spent treating these children rather than having a direct diagnosis for them. There are biomarkers in the Krebs cycle that we could look at. And you can see here this particular individual had high malic acid. And these are all indications of energy problems in the mitochondrial pathway area. So what Rosenall and Fry concluded was that in the medical literature that was written looking at metabolic problems in autistic children, only 21% had a genetic abnormality that might account for mitochondrial dysfunction. And that number, 21%, is actually, I think, rather high. I think this was I think most children will not have a genetic abnormality per se, a genetic variance, but not a genetic abnormality. Dr. Poling, who is the neurologist father of Hannah Poling, who became famous recently for getting a $20 million settlement from Health and Human Services because she received 9 vaccines in one day and became quote-unquote autistic. What she became was encephalitic. She had an encephalitis from getting those vaccines. And it was interesting that her case was a test case. So they were going, the vaccine court was going to use Hannah Poling as a test case to determine whether thimerosal injured children, thimerosal being that organic mercury-laden preservative that's used in so many vaccines and is still used in so many vaccines, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But they were going to use her as a test case, but when Dr. Poling presented her data as a neurologist, and her mother's a nurse and a lawyer, it was clear she actually had a mitochondrial disease, and they pulled her out as a test case because, as Dr. Gerberding, the then head of the CDC, she's now the head of the Merck vaccine division. Of course, I question whether she was always the head of the Merck vaccine division and was just acting as the head of the CDC. She says, well, this is not relevant to autism because most kids with autism do not have mitochondrial problems. And I remember when she had that little press conference, I went, and how does she know that? What has the CDC done to actually look to see how many children with autism have mitochondrial problems? She has done nothing. The CDC has done nothing. She was lying through her teeth. And the CDC has been obfuscating and preventing a non-vaccine vaccine trial where you compare children who have been vaccinated and children who have not been vaccinated. They have been refusing to do those clinical trials because they already know the answer, that there is a susceptible subset of the population who is very vulnerable to the environmental stressors that are contained in the poisons in the vaccine, and they do not want that information out there because it will kill this public health program. And anyways, I get stuck on my soapbox and I get stuck on that slide. There you go. So I'm advancing the slide. And I think this slide's a little bit out of order here, but again, there are biomarkers that we can look at in the metabolic cycles that many of the kids with autism have problems with, and this is just another one. Okay, back to the mitochondria, because we're still on the mitochondria here. Mitochondria is ground zero for this problem, as I'll explain a little later. So the TCA cycle, the Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle, is impacted by mitochondrial dysfunction and again results in elevation in pyruvate, lactate, and alanine. And of course, if your mitochondria is not functioning properly, there's an inhibition of aerobic respiration, which impairs fatty acid oxidation, leading to abnormalities in certain carnitine levels. We can look at carnitine and determine whether those levels are elevated or not, and look at some of the fatty acids involved also that are essential for the operation of the human body, and also determine indirectly that there's mitochondrial dysfunction. And some of the children that are affected have issues with the urea cycle, and that too, it has its connection to the mitochondria and mitochondrial function. Some children, you can smell the ammonia on their breath, especially after they eat things with protein, and you have to eat things with protein. But those are children who have urea cycle problems. Again, correct the mitochondria and you correct many of these problems. So this slide is just a, back up for a minute overview of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with environmental stressors that impair the detoxification system further. So the bodies accumulate even more of the toxins without being able to get rid of them. That increases oxidative stress. And the oxidative stress affects even further the metabolic cycles that are involved in creating the ingredients like glutathione that detoxify the human body, and the methylation cycle, which is important for signaling DNA to turn on and turn off. So you have a lot of genes that are just switching off in children with autism. And then this affects the immune system as well, because the immune system is run genetically, and it switches the immune system from the T helper cell 1 pathway to the T helper cell 2 pathway. So you now start having a lot of autoimmune reactions and allergies, and as things further break down, you get gut infections, your intestines start to break down. Peptides and proteins that normally wouldn't be absorbed in the human body come into the bloodstream, and you form allergies to them, and they go to the brain where they don't belong, causing further behavioral problems. That's where the gut-brain connection comes along, and then there are all these super infections because your gut is full of bugs, and now they're just having a field day, yeast, viruses, because your immune system isn't functioning. So autism, quote-unquote autism, this environmental illness, is a non-trivial matter to treat, but treat we must. And children can be helped a great deal if we look truly at what's going on. So that's what this slide's about, looking with more clarity about what's happening. A few of the environmental toxins that are involved in this disorder. Most recently, in one study, you'll be surprised to learn that Tylenol, if given with the MMR vaccine, has a direct association with autism rates. So why would that be? Well, we know that acetaminophen depletes glutathione. It just crashes glutathione levels in the liver. So here you are giving the body toxins and at the same time crashing the body's ability to deal with those toxins. In 2007, the Environmental Working Group came, the collaboration on health and the environment came out with a consensus statement that the neurodevelopmental disorders that we're seeing are directly related to the environment. And there's no doubt that mercury exposure causes learning and developmental disorders. And you hear me sometimes go 19. In 1999, the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Public Health Service of the United States came out to the public and said, we will remove thimerosal from vaccine. They made this statement, and it's very interesting that they made this statement because they knew something was coming down the pike. They had advanced warning that the epidemiological data that the CDC was gathering on the vaccine safety data sets showed that there was a significant increase in neurodevelopmental learning disorders in children who have been vaccinated with thimerosal. But when the secret Simpsonwood meeting met in 2000 in Simpsonwood, Georgia, their object was not to do something about this other than cover it up. So the epidemiologist who at the CDC who came up with the study was immediately hired by GlaxoSmithKline and perverted the data. He diluted the data 4 times, and finally he diluted it so much the significance of thimerosal affecting learning disabilities disappeared, and that was published by the American Academy of Pediatrics, even though the American Academy of Pediatrics was represented at the Simpsonwood meeting and knew very well that the CDC had data showing that thimerosal caused learning disabilities. But I don't want you to think that vaccines are the only problem. Vaccines are not the only problem. The pollutants in our air are also a problem. Coal-fired power plants spewing out mercury into the environment. We're breathing it in. It gets in the fish we eat. It kills our lakes and our streams. And more and more, these power plants are coming online. Why would San Francisco be important? Well, all of California is the first one to get hit by the mercury plume that comes from China and all their coal-fired power plants. So this is a global problem. China is getting the vaccines that are still full of thimerosal because the quote-unquote reduced thimerosal vaccines are only being used in certain European countries and in the United States. The rest of the world is getting the full set of vaccines with thimerosal. So I think there are now over 4 million children in China with autism. And on one hand, that's good news because apparently as humans, we don't do anything until bodies start to pile up. And if we want to save our species on this planet and not poison ourselves off the planet, some of these children are sacrificing themselves for our benefit. But I would prefer to stop the sacrifice sooner rather than later and listen to what they're telling us. They're telling us we as humans cannot tolerate the pollution that we're exposing ourselves to. This is the famous Palmer study showing a direct relationship between the proximity one is to a polluted area of mercury and the amount of educational services required in that area to treat autism. Very telling. That this slide shows you the environmental the mercury hotspots of North America, and of course the air. That's you can consider that the plume coming from China. So let's go back to Hannah Poling, the little girl who got a $20 million settlement from HHS. This is one of the press releases that came out where the U.S. government concedes that the vaccines caused her encephalopathy. In fact, the Pace Environmental Law Review, the Pace Law School, this year, a few months ago, came out with a white paper showing that of the 100 cases that they looked at, that the vaccine court settled with parents because they had seizures or epilepsy or encephalopathy caused by vaccine. Most of those cases, most of those children had autism. But autism is not autism, as I've been trying to say. And this was a study that just came out a few months ago showing a statistical positive association between autism and the number of vaccines received. So the truth about vaccines is out there, and of course you probably already know that vaccine manufacturers are completely immune from any damage their vaccines are doing. And with so many patents running out on so many drugs, Big Pharma is looking to vaccinations as their cash cow as the years go by. So you will see more and more vaccines come on the market if we allow them to be used. So as I said, the mitochondria is ground zero for the mercury in the environmental bomb, but certainly mercury in particular. And this is important because there's some biomarkers that we can look at to determine this toxicity burden. And perhaps one of the most important biomarkers, and really one of the easiest biomarkers to determine, is porphyrins. And porphyrins are the building blocks of the hemoglobin molecule. And heme is probably the most well-known porphyrin. And if you look at the urine of children who have been exposed to toxins, you can actually get a fairly good idea which toxins they have been exposed to by looking at the pattern of these porphyrins that spill in their urine. Xenobiotic compounds refers to compounds that are derived from organisms, bacteria and funguses. This is a pattern that would be produced from being exposed to aluminum, arsenic, and this is a slide about lead, because really lead and mercury are two of the most important toxins that we have to deal with. And the reason why lead and mercury are so important is that there's a synergy between the two of them. And so one can say, oh, here's a little mercury, here's a little lead, no big deal. It is a big deal because the toxicological data tells us that the lethal dose of amount of mercury to kill 1 in 100 rats. A lot of you have heard of the LD50 test, the amount of toxin or poison or substance given to rats to kill 50 out of 100 rats. It's called the LD50. It's used in toxicological research. If you give the LD1 of mercury to 100 rats, and that's the amount of mercury to kill 1 out of those 100 rats, and you add that to 20% of the LD1 of lead, all 100 rats will die. So we're dealing with a very logarithmic synergy between mercury and lead. And this is the pattern that lead produces in the porphyrin, in the urinary porphyrins. And this is all very easy to assess, and it's probably one of the most important biomarkers to do in the initial workup of children on the spectrum. Mercury targets 2 enzymes in the porphyrin assembly line. Lead affects 8. And this is the spike you see with mercury. And this is a quantitative, those graphs I was showing you were qualitative ways of looking at porphyrins. This is a quantitative way of looking at porphyrins. And you can see the coporphyrin 1 and 3 is very high in this particular individual. And that would speak very highly of a lead problem. This article tells us that if you take those individuals who are spilling urinary copoporphyrin and those who have abnormally high levels of coproporphyrin, and you give them a chelating substance, in this case DMPS, they will have a much higher spillage of or extractable fraction of mercury in their urine than those who have normal coproporphyrin levels. So this is another way of verifying that in fact the elevated coproporphyrin levels do have a direct relationship with how much mercury is in the body. This is an example of a urine toxic metal test done on someone who has not been challenged, someone who has not received a provoking agent. But when you give them a provoking agent such as DMSA or DMPS, this is what comes out in their urine. This is one of my patients, and as you can see, the mercury is in the red zone. Now, these values, these reference values are for non-provoked results. There are no reference values for provoked or extractable fraction, because that's another way of calling this challenge test, where you're challenging the body with a DMPS or DMSA or EDTA. But despite the fact that the red zone is for non-provoked tests, it gives you a very good assessment of what is being extracted from the body and what's in the body. None of this should be in the body. That much mercury should not be in the body. You should not be able to extract that. These are the levels of coproporphyrin in relationship with different disease states. And of course, as you can see, that autism is above the 2 standard deviations above normal. And it's interesting that when you combine it with epilepsy or epilepsy alone, because most epilepsy is considered idiopathic, which means we don't know why this child has epilepsy. Well, if you're spilling this much porphyrins, we do know why that child has epilepsy. They have mitochondrial dysfunction. So a lot of children who just have seizures can be treated with for their environmental illness, because that's what this is saying, that they have an environmental illness, and that's what set off their quote-unquote idiopathic epilepsy. So the electron transport chain, which is what ETC stands for, is the oxidative phosphorylation pathway. And it is the target for free radicals, reactive oxygen species. And it is protected by glutathione and superoxide dismutase. These antioxidants are very important in protecting the mitochondria. And we already know from work that's been published, for example, at Stanford, that children with autism have lower glutathione levels. And depletion of glutathione in the mitochondria make the mitochondria and the cells they're in very susceptible to oxidative damage. And I like to say, if and I thought I had a slide about this somewhere, that if the mitochondria is ground zero, then oxidative stress is thermite. So I want to start transitioning and talking about the methylation cycle, because the methylation cycle ultimately determines how much glutathione can be produced, and as well as being responsible for regulating the methylation of DNA and proteins. And that's very important, because when methyl groups get added, and a methyl group is a carbon with 3 hydrogens attached to it. When methyl groups get added to DNA molecules and to proteins, those entities get regulated. They turn on and they turn off. So if you are damaging the master controller, which is the methylation cycle, if you are damaging the very things that turn these switches on and off, then the human body will not work as it was designed to work. So the methylation cycle, which is supported by folic acid, which is supported and dependent on B12 activity, which ends up turning these switches on and off, and which ends up creating more glutathione, even though that part of the equation is not in the methylation cycle itself. It's something called transsulfuration. But that is dependent on what happens in the methyl cycle. Here's another way of looking at the methyl cycle, and you can see glutathione being produced at the bottom. Again, glutathione, the body's major antioxidant and protector. You can, if you're familiar with chess, glutathione is the pawns. They're at the front line. They protect all the other pieces on the chess set. So there are some enzymes in the methylation cycle that we can actually look to see if they're functioning properly. MTHFR over on your left, methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. Again, it's all about methyl. That turns folic acid into biologically active folic acid. And COMT over on your right, catechol-O-methyltransferase. These enzymes have genes, and we can look at the activity of those genes and determine if a child is more susceptible than your average man on the street to having a damaged methylation cycle. And despite what the academicians have to say, a significant portion of autistic children, quote-unquote autistic children, children who have encephalopathies caused by environmental toxins, have impaired methylation and antioxidant detoxification kinetics. And biomedical intervention is really all about helping those metabolic pathways function to their highest level and supporting the body with extra products that those pathways normally would be making if you were healthy, if the body was not being poisoned. So often we will give extra glutathione, we will give extra B12, we will give extra biologically active folic acid to support the methylation cycle, because that is such a keystone cycle in the detoxification system and in the way the body expresses its genes. Again, this is another slide of the methylation cycle. Number one is the folic acid cycle, number two is the methionine cycle, and number three is the transsulfuration pathway, where you're taking, where you're creating glutathione and taking oxidized glutathione, the glutathione disulfide, into reduced glutathione. Now, when you give folinic acid, which is the biologically active form of folic acid, and you give B12, it increases glutathione levels and improves cysteine levels. It does not affect the level of SAM, however. Okay. So this is a slide that shows how the synthesis of bioactive methylcobalamin requires glutathione and SAM. And if you give cyanocobalamin, which is the normal, when middle-aged women used to go to their doctors and get B12 shots, they were usually getting shots of cyanocobalamin, and most of the B12 and vitamins is cyanocobalamin. We prefer to give, in biomedical intervention, we prefer to give methylcobalamin, which is the active form, unless that child has mutations in that COMT enzyme that I talked about earlier. We prefer not to overburden those children with extra methyl groups because they have problems moving those methyl groups around. So in that case, we would give them hydroxycobalamin, which is over on your left. Both of those still require extra glutathione to be converted into methylcobalamin. And then the methionine synthase, which is at the heart of the methylation cycle, is B12 dependent, and the methionine synthase is the target of mercury in poisoning the methylation cycle. So to review, and I'm sorry if I'm being repetitive here, but I'd like everyone to have the take-home message here. There are biomarkers we can look for. We can look for impaired methylation in the bodies of affected children. Is the SAM ratio down? Is the ratio of glutathione, reduced glutathione versus oxidized glutathione down? And we can look for mutations encoding for some of the enzymes that are intricately involved in the methylation cycle. Again, a slide showing you where thimerosal affects the process here in the mitochondria. These are all metabolic activities that are taking place in the mitochondria and in other cells. I mean, of course, the mitochondria are in all our cells. And the work of Jill James, I would like to pay homage to her because the work she's done at the University of Arkansas showing that glutathione is so very important and it's so very perturbed in the metabolic pathways of affected children that we need to take the information and the findings in basic medical research and apply them clinically. That's what translational medicine is about, where you translate the work in the laboratory, you translate the work from double-blind studies, you translate that into clinical practice. And perhaps translational medicine has been the weakest link in the chain because the pharmaceutical companies don't care about translating our knowledge into practical clinical usage, because all they care about is selling their drugs. And if they don't have something to sell, you're not going to find out about it. And pharmaceutical companies control the practice of medicine in this country. Okay. Way back in 1985, we knew that mercury affects glutathione. No surprise. I've been talking about it all morning or afternoon, depending on where you're listening to this. And this is from the work of Dr. James at the University of Arkansas, showing you the difference between controlled children and autistic children in glutathione and the fact that they have reduced ratios of GSH and GSSH, which is the oxidized form of glutathione. That's glutathione that's already spent and done its thing. So you want more GSH and less GSSH. But in autistic children, they have a lot of GSSH and they don't have a lot of glutathione, GSH. So here's my slide that I was talking about, where oxidative stress is the thermite if mitochondria is ground zero. And as a result, we have neuroinflammation, infectious processes, and we can actually look at the DNA that's produced in our body and determine what impact oxidative stress is having. And when I say oxidative stress, what does that mean? If I use the analogy of a piece of iron and over time it gets brown and rusty, that's iron that's undergoing oxidative stress. So to survive on this planet, which has a lot of oxygen on it, you have to protect yourself from oxidative stress. Otherwise, you will slowly fall apart, just as iron will fall apart as it starts to rust. So we can look at our DNA and our RNA, the DNA, which is what makes up genes, and the RNA, which is the messenger from those genes, and determine, are these very important pieces of how our body works getting oxidized? And 8-OHG, which you can find in the urine, is one of the ways of determining RNA oxidation. And oxidation directly impacts on methionine synthase. So we have a situation where every day we're learning more and more about the biomarkers that are affecting all of us, not just autistic children, who are being impacted by the environment. And I hope by now I've kind of made this clear that what we're calling autism is a medical problem and not a psychiatric disorder. And we can look at things like oxidative stress, methylation and transsulfuration, the toxins that accumulate in the body, immune system deregulation, and gastrointestinal inflammation as all part of this medical problem. And why is that important? Because we can treat it. It's a medical problem. So I'm going to take just a couple of slides here to talk about hyperbaric oxygen, because that's mostly what I do. I came into this from hyperbarics, and what hyperbaric oxygen does is increase the levels of inflammatory biochemicals. It will lower your C-reactive protein. That was just on the news yesterday, that women should be having their C-reactive proteins measured as a risk factor for having heart attacks. Hyperbaric oxygen greatly lowers C-reactive protein. It helps with key antioxidant systems. It increases oxidation to functioning mitochondria. It makes new mitochondria, mitochondrial biogenesis. It improves the immune system. It downregulates autoimmune function. The list is long, and I know a lot of people do not have access to hyperbaric oxygen. It's expensive. It's not accessible, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't know about it. It's an important part of treating premature aging, the effects of being poisoned by mercury and lead and pesticides. It helps the body recover. And here's just some of the enzymes that hyperbaric oxygen will upregulate to protect the body. And so at the pressures that we use to treat children on the spectrum, these enzymes actually go up. And why is this important? Because some of the children have what's called autistic enterocolitis, inflammation. They have inflammation of the brain. They have inflammation of the gut. Again, remember the gut-brain connection. So what's going on in their gut is also going on in their brain. And many of the children have GI patterns that are very similar to what you see in people who have been diagnosed with Crohn's disease. So this is, again, a medical problem. No, not every child with autism has GI symptoms, but many do. And if you do, it just makes treatment that much more complicated. But I know so many children, their parents take them to physicians, and they complain about GI problems and diarrhea, and the physicians just say, well, that's autism, that's what you have to expect, and just live with it. This is insanity. We have been exposed to insanity by conventional medicine, and many children and many families have suffered needlessly because people have had their heads in the sand about this, and it's time for us to pull our heads out of the sand. If you actually look at the stools of many of these children, you can see what's called dysbiosis. The wrong kind of bacteria in the wrong places, the wrong amount of fungus in the wrong places. And this impacts on intestinal permeability, which I talked about, the quote-unquote leaky gut, which causes allergies to develop. So one of the vicious cycles that are involved and the biomarkers that we can look for to determine the extent of this medical problem. So one of the tests we use is the IgG food sensitivity panels. IgG is an antibody class, and as you can see from this example from one of my patients, they are extremely food sensitive to dairy products and extremely sensitive to Candida albicans, which is the yeast that opportunistically infect the gut. And the gut is the biggest immune organ in our body. A healthy gut is a healthy immune system. So it is important to heal the gut in these children. If they have infections, those infections need to be treated. One of the biomarkers that we look at is neopterin, urinary neopterin. This is a biomarker of inflammation, and this can be elevated if there's inflammation in the gut or if there's inflammation in the brain. Okay, Dr. Deef is one of the great experts on the biochemistry affecting autistic children. And this is an overview of, again, the environmental factors and the genetics in those that affect. You can see COMT down the and MTHFR genes in there. And I think it's very important to test for these genetic mutations because it gives us, even though, and I've said this several times, even though autism is not a genetic disease, there are genetic polymorphisms that we should know about, if possible, in the affected children, because if you have MTHFR, you will know why you have to be taking folinic acid for the rest of your life. If you have a COMT mutation, you will know why you have to be supplemented with B12, preferably hydroxy B12 for the rest of your life. And it's not just about giving these supplements until the child feels better or they lose their diagnosis. Unfortunately, many children do lose their diagnosis when they're treated appropriately. It's about knowing what your foundational makeup is, and so that there is the rationale to be taking these supplements for the rest of your life, because the environment is not getting cleaned up. We are still being exposed to these toxins every day. So this slide is an overview of some of the biomarkers that can be looked at and should be looked at in children on the spectrum, and hopefully can be looked at. I know that there's always insurance issues and things like that, but really that's why we have to take this whole paradigm and stop calling it autism and calling it an encephalopathy, calling it a metabolic syndrome with enzyme deficiencies. That's what we're dealing with. And unfortunately, this has been a man-made problem, as I've said more than once. This is an example of an organic acid test. Organic acids are things that we can use to determine abnormal metabolic cycles going on in the body. It is perhaps the most efficient and effective way of determining fungal overgrowth, because funguses produce organic acids that the human body normally doesn't produce. So by looking at the organic acids, you can tell if someone has a abnormal fungal overgrowth. Why don't we just do a stool culture and look for it that way? Well, because the yeast actually is not all that willing to be shed. They like to hang in their home they don't like to necessarily be sloughed off. So sometimes you don't recover yeast in the stool test, and this is a much more efficient way of determining whether someone is having a yeast problem. Many children have problems with oxalates, and again, this is also something that can be looked at as a biomarker, should be looked at as a biomarker, because it'll affect the way their diet is structured. And I haven't said anything about diet yet, but dietary intervention is one of the most important treatments in the biomedical intervention paradigm. Looking at amino acids is also an important way of determining how someone is, where they're at metabolically, but it's also, as with some of the other biomarkers, a way of determining how well that child is improving. So you don't just do some of these tests once. You have to repeat them. Are you actually making progress? Of course, you know if your child's not talking and now they start talking, you know that is certainly a behavioral benchmark. But it's also good to document the biomarkers. Because of the damaged mitochondrial system, fatty acid utilization and oxidation is also damaged. So there are fatty acids that we can look at, indirectly determining the level of mitochondrial dysfunction. Is this complicated? Yes, this is very complicated. This is very difficult to understand sometimes. Pediatricians are not trained in this. There are very few physicians trained in helping a poisoned body regain health. Very few physicians. That's why parents have to educate themselves on these subjects. And I know that is a daunting task, but it is part of what I impart to parents. Learn about these damaged metabolic pathways. Know what your child needs to be tested for, and use those biomarkers to determine the interventions. And this slide summarizes some of the major supplements that are used in the biomedical intervention based on the published literature, not because I say so. This is based on studies that have been done. Will your average physician know about these studies? Of course not. Your average physician will only know what the pharmaceutical company tells them. So again, it is the responsibility and it's the burden right now of parents to become their own physician, to become their child's physician. And in homage to Dr. Deeth, I'm showing these slides because the human species has developed over millions of years, and it has developed in response to environmental stressors. And as each stressor came out and we successfully navigated through that stressor, we built upon our DNA. And what's taking place now on this planet, perhaps since the Industrial Revolution in the last 150 years, is not evolution, but devolution, where man is actually disconnecting from nature. He is disconnecting his DNA. He's dissembling himself. And one of the most recent developments is language and social skills. So no surprise, language and social skills are the first ones to be lost in these poisoned children. There's a reason. First one, last, what is it? Last one hired, first one fired. That's what's going on a DNA level. So it's time to not only think about this, but do something about this. And I hope I've probably beat that horse dead by now, but I'm ready to start taking questions because this is the end of the formal presentation. So if anyone has any questions, type them in and we can go from there. Oh, we're getting some questions. Okay. All right, the first question I'd like to address is someone has TRICARE, which is a military insurance, and they'd like to take their son to a military physician. What tests should they run? I think I've kind of gone over that a little bit here in my talk. What test should you get done first? If someone asks me, well, if there's just one test, which one should I do first? First, morning urine porphyrin test with Great Plains Lab, LabCorp. Not all labs do the porphyrin test correctly. It can be lab dependent, unfortunately. And the second test that I would do would be first morning urine organic acid test. Okay, hold on. I'm just making sure this call is not about the webinar. Yes, go ahead. Speaking. Oh, I'm going to have to call you back. Okay. All right. Well, can you please provide links to the research quotes? You guys are very demanding. We are being prescribed 300 milligrams per day of L-carnitine for leaky gut by a doctor at Mass General. Sorry, 3,000, 3 grams. Yes, that should be an adequate amount. 3 grams of CoQ10 is a good dose too. A lot of people take CoQ10, but they don't take enough of it. How can I get a list of supplements? People want obviously a copy of this. I would contact Great Plains Lab if you guys want a copy of this presentation, and we're also going to post it in a PDF version on the New Hope Clinic website. And of course, you're looking at the New Hope Clinic web address right now, newhopeclinics.com. So we'll post a PDF of this presentation. Yes, yes. Several questions about getting copies of the slides. Sorry, I'm reading these questions. If you can't find a suitable MD, how do you find a doctor, a small town in Canada? I feel for you out there, but this is very difficult. You're going to have to travel. There are only a handful of doctors that know what to do. Now, there are a lot of people who are on the DAN list, you know, the Defeat Autism Now list for doctors who use biomedical intervention. And without getting myself into too much hot water, they're all well-meaning, and many of them are very knowledgeable, but there's only a handful of doctors who really see the big picture and have the workup down appropriately for kids. So a lot of times DAN doctors do a little of this and a little of that, and there's, you know, they have to tiptoe around people's financial issues. But my philosophy is to uncover as many of these biomarkers as quickly as possible and determine a biomedical protocol for that child, and continue to evolve that intervention as their biomarkers change, because the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking on these children, and treating an autistic child who's 20 years old is not the same as treating one who's 5 years old. Those 15 years can never come back. No matter how intelligent that child is, the chances of recovering a 20-year-old child and having that child be able to keep a job and sustain themselves is not high. So to be able to do these interventions on little children is so important. That doesn't mean your 20-year-old shouldn't have intervention. I treated a 20-year-old and his brain recovered so much. I have never seen neurocognitive scores as high as this boy was able to create. But at the same time, now his mother's going to have to hire a life coach because he's missed 20 years of learning to be normal. And I put normal in quotations. But you know what I'm talking about. Having a brain that functions properly, having an immune system that functions properly. Have you heard when OSR will be reapproved by the FDA? Not anytime soon, and for those of you who are still listening, OSR was a chemical that Dr. Bailey, the emeritus professor, Haley, the emeritus professor at the University of Kentucky, developed, which was a true chelator of mercury, arsenic, and lead. And the FDA cracked down on all products that were even indirectly being inferred as being chelating things for children. So Dr. Haley is jumping through a lot of hoops with the FDA right now. I anticipate it could be years before we'll see OSR being sold to the public. What can be accomplished and how if we don't have access to HBOT? If you don't have access to HBOT, again, I like to use hyperbaric oxygen as actually the icing on the cake anyways. That's not the first intervention I like children to have. I like to bring it in where after their diets have been appropriately changed, after they're on all the appropriate supplements for their metabolic abnormalities, after they've been getting detoxed if that's what they need, and most children do need that. Then I like to bring hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and if finances permit, you can always buy your own portable chamber. I think 100% oxygen takes you where you need to go faster, but for some children, they do respond to just compressed room air at 1.3 atmospheres, which is what portable chambers deliver. I know who wrote this question. Ken, can you explain what the International Hyperbaric Medical Foundation is doing with translational medicine to move this translational science forward? So to give everyone a ray of hope, the organization, the sister organization that I am president of, I'm president of the International Hyperbaric Medical Association, but its sister organization, the foundation, has put together the infrastructure to, in conjunction with the John Eisenberg Treatment Registry, to create a way for translational medicine to be done, which means you take the results of randomized controlled trials and things of that nature, and you turn them into studies that take place in the real world. Everyone gets treatment. You don't have to do controls and placebos and worry about any of that. Using something called Bayesian analysis, everyone can get treated, and you take these very practical treatment modalities and you report them in with an IRB approved protocol to a treatment registry, and that is translational medicine, and these studies are as important, and they're as an important part in evidence-based medicine as randomized control trials. And they're the missing link, the part that hasn't been done, taking our knowledge and moving it out into the real world, having real physicians treat real patients. And when information about the results of translational studies get out, third-party payers have to jump, and even physicians in the community have to adapt because this now becomes standard practice. Okay, can we also review how one can resume moderate oxidase is expected to improve over time with diminished systemic candida? Well, yes, this question is about oxalates and being on an oxalate diet, and what if you get rid of because the yeast Candida albicans creates a lot of oxalates. So yes, in part the answer is correct that if you get rid of the yeast problem, your oxalates drop down, and it's possible to go off of your oxalate diet, a low oxalate diet. But then again, that is what the biomarkers are for, because if you do that and your oxalates go up again, then you have to return to your low oxalate diet. Oh, display the supplements on the screen again. Okay, hold on. Supplements coming up. All right, the supplements are now on the screen again. I have an MTHFR polymorphism. Which type of folic acid should I take? There are several versions of biologically active folic acid. I recommend people take folinic acid because some of the other biologically active versions of folic acid have methyl groups on them. And if you do not know your COMT status, I do not like to overburden, again, the body with methyl groups. So folinic acid is and you can buy that over the counter. You do not need a prescription for folinic acid, although it is sold in a prescription form, and that's called leucovorin, which is the reason why you can get that at your local pharmacy. Is it's used in methotrexate rescue for cancer patients. Because guess what? A lot of chemotherapies damage the methylation cycle. Okay. How long does it generally take to see some progress with either test results or behavior in the person? Okay. So that depends on the child, but oftentimes we see almost instantaneous results. Here in Santa Monica, we treated a child who was apraxic. He couldn't talk. And we gave him a challenge, a urine toxic metal challenge test intravenously with a lot of glutathione and B vitamins, and just as a chaser. And he was a hard stick, as we like to call it, and it took us 5 hours to go through 2 IV bags on him, but that was long enough for actually us to start to see the results of the metabolic changes that these substances were causing. And when he left the clinic, he said goodbye to everybody verbally and was counting. So sometimes the results are instant, sometimes they're not. On the other end of the spectrum, I know parents who have done everything possibly correctly, and their children improve. There's no question their children are improving. But when you're starting way back in the pack, it's a long way to the front of the line, and it can be slow in many children. So, so no one is to be discouraged. And yet, at the same token, I have seen severely affected kids completely lose their diagnosis just by staying away from gluten and casein. So we're dealing with a group of children who are very varied in the way they've been affected, and then what's affecting them in particular. What works on one kid doesn't necessarily work on another. That's why having knowledge of the biomarkers is really the only logical and practical way of approaching this from a medical point of view. To do anything less is really just pulling straws out of the air or doing something because some crazy doctor on a webinar told you to, and that's not the way to approach this disorder. This is a serious medical problem. It should be worked up as a serious medical problem, and it's really affecting all of us. It's affecting the parents of the kids who share the same genetics with their children. Obviously, their parents don't have autism per se, but they could, as the years go by, end up getting Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease and cancer. And so the very interventions that are helping their children should be looked at as interventions that the parents use as well. How can I get the, okay, we're going to put the presentation again on the website. We are currently on day 11 of our second round of HBOT, and he's very non-compliant and needs constant pressure and stimming and hyper and giggly. My question for you is this a child who is getting biomedical intervention? Because this is why I don't recommend sticking children in hyperbaric chambers as an initial therapy. I don't want children whose guts are full of yeast to go directly in the hyperbaric chambers. I do not want children whose diets haven't been straightened out to go in the hyperbaric chambers. I want every single metabolic pathway that we can address to be addressed prior to going into a hyperbaric chamber. Because remember, I'm the president of the International Hyperbaric Medical Association. I don't want to have bad results. I don't want people saying, I used hyperbarics and it didn't work. Well, it's not going to work if you don't address all these metabolic and biomedical issues first. Okay. Explain that only by doing an IRB-approved study can information be provided in real time to third-party payers. Yes, I think I already said that. That's what translational medicine is all about. Yes, slides will be available. It appears that many people who are not diagnosed within the diet are likely to be close, if not actually within the spectrum. What do you think? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And there have been times where I have felt very autistic myself, not artistic, but autistic. We are all getting poisoned. Go out there and have tuna fish every day and see where you are in 3 years. People need to understand that the poisons that are affecting the autistic children are affecting all of us. We all need to be doing something to detoxify ourselves. If that just means taking extra NAC so you can bump up your glutathione levels, do that. Colloidal gold. I mean, there's just so many natural things. Chlorella, cilantro. There's so many things that a non-affected adult can do to help slowly detoxify their bodies. It is unfortunate. It is unfortunate that we have to do this, but we are breathing and eating and living and drinking in a polluted environment. We all need to be getting these therapies. We all need to be detoxified. What would you recommend? What would you recommend HBOT while doing antiviral? Yeah, well, yes. One does not have to be on Valtrex for a year or be chelated for 2 years before you do hyperbaric oxygen therapy. That is not what I'm saying. I am saying all these I's should be dotted and all those metabolic T's should be crossed before getting in the chamber, though. That is really the most efficient way to do it. And I have had experience with parents, newbie parents, who are all excited about hyperbaric oxygen and think it's the only answer, the main answer, and they rush into it, and their results are not as stellar as if they had been doing biomedical intervention, and their motivation for doing biomedical intervention is not as strong if they start with hyperbaric oxygen. They don't have the patience. Obviously, they were impatient. They immediately wanted hyperbaric oxygen. So that is why I recommend saving it for the last step. But the last step does not need to be delayed by years, by any means. Is there a difference between soft chambers and hard chambers and the results? Yes, I think it's been shown that using 1.5 atmospheres of 100% oxygen and 1.3 atmospheres of room air will decrease your C-reactive protein much more, and the C-reactive protein is a biomarker of inflammation. So yes, intuitively, I think 100% oxygen gets the children where they need to go faster. And I think if you follow their biomarkers, the right biomarkers, that bears itself out. But if 1.3 atmospheres of room air is all you have available, use it, okay? Because if you live off the beaten track, hundreds of miles away from a freestanding hyperbaric center where you could get 100% oxygen at 1.5 pressure, you're going to have to treat yourself at home with a soft chamber. The IHMA has been, oh, I can see this. My executive director has been feeding messages here. The IHMA has been working with legislatures who have been keen interest in moving effective autism treatments forward. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Duncan. How does the how does disease prevention by 5-year-old from speaking? I'm not sure what that question is. How does disease? Well, it's not. If you mean by how does the disease prevent your 5-year-old from speaking? Because it damages the genes and the DNA in the most recent evolutionary pathways in the brain. That's how it stopped. That's why these children become apraxic. It's one of the features of mercury poisoning, is to lose the ability to speak, because it affects the areas of the brain most vulnerable to these poisons, and they're most vulnerable because they're the most recent additions to our brain and DNA. Remember I said last hired, first fired? Okay. I have been asked to raise my son's B6 to 4 milligrams per pound. That is about 9 milligrams and magnesium. What is the general consensus about for Dan? I do not know this is from Bangladesh. Hello, Bangladesh. I do not know what the consensus is among Dan doctors. By doing these biomarkers, you can actually determine some of and of course, autistic children need those B vitamins. Those B vitamins are very important in supporting the methylation cycle. But you have to be very careful with B vitamins too, because a lot of affected children cannot handle large doses of B vitamins. You have to be very careful in giving them these vitamins because they are not able to integrate them. And you can be robbing Peter and paying Paul. So you can be solving one problem and creating another because their metabolic systems are not able to process some of these vitamins. So whether there's consensus, I don't think there's very few Dan doctors who have consensus on anything other than that this is a medical problem. But just be careful in raising the dose of B vitamins if you have not done the biomarkers that we've been talking about today. And it looks like Dr. Duncan's saying we're also going to put the slide presentation and the research on the International Hyperbaric Medical Foundation website. My test turned up high for Clostridia. I'm losing that question. Related compound, should I take probiotics? Probiotics is perhaps the best and most effective treatment for Clostridia overgrowth. So yes, you should take probiotics. Giving 800 milligrams of CoQ10, are these slides available on Great Plains site? No, I don't know if they're going to be available, yes, at the Great Plains site, at the New Hope's Clinic website, and apparently at the International Hyperbaric Medical Foundation website. Okay, all of our tests so far have come back within normal ranges. What should be our next step? Well, of course, my question for you is, what does all of our tests mean? Because a lot of times the right tests don't always get done. And you'd be surprised how many people don't do urinary porphyrins with the right lab. Has to be done with the right lab, not just getting done. If you do urinary porphyrins at Quest or Tricor, that is not satisfactory. So all the right tests have to be done, and they have to be done at the right labs. So I would need to see what you've done to say, you know. But I can tell you from my own experience that once in a while, I'm talking like 1 in 500 kids, the tests will come back all normal. And I will tell the parents of that child that whatever they have, they are not on the spectrum. They are not children of this environmental illness. So not everyone who displays autism-like behaviors is on this spectrum of environmental illness. Whatever their problem is something else, and we don't have necessarily all the answers, certainly don't have all the answers. But the vast majority of the children will have abnormal biomarkers, and that's why we do them. How do I make an appointment with New Hope's Clinic? Go to our website, look at the phone number. That's one way to do it. That's what I would do. What about the effects of the plasticizers? Oh, yeah, there are so many poisons out there, endocrine disruptors, and we know nothing about their synergy. You know, volatile organic compounds and pesticides can push kids into environmentally triggered encephalopathy. So, you know, no one should get the idea that any one chemical is to blame. It's a synergy of all these chemicals, and you know, when testing gets done, which isn't very safety testing, they always isolate these things. We're not getting them in an isolated fashion. We're drinking aspartame and diet sodas and drinking fluoridated water, and we're eating, you know, mercury-laden fish, and these things are all happening together in our bodies, and it's a freaking miracle that we are still walking and talking. But I can tell you, we are in a period of devolution, and unless we clean up the environment, we will destroy our ability to stay on this planet. The Earth will get along fine without us. I don't know if we will. You think that Tylenol allows viruses to cross the blood-brain barrier, or that there is permanent vulnerability created at the blood-brain barrier due to an earlier insult, such as a vaccine adjuvants? I think we know how Tylenol works in terms of destroying the glutathione levels in our cells. So by destroying our glutathione levels, suddenly our whole immune system takes a hit. And it would allow viruses to get a foothold where they otherwise wouldn't be able to get a foothold. So, and the interesting thing is the more severe a reaction a child gets to the MMR vaccine, the more Tylenol they're probably likely to get, which just actually increases the danger for them. Okay, can you go wrong with supplementing glutathione? In a general sense, no, you cannot go wrong with supplementing glutathione, but there are only so many ways you can take it. Because plain glutathione cannot be taken orally, it's destroyed in the stomach. But you can inhale it, you can get it an IV, you can swallow it in modified chemical forms. You can take NAC, which is N-acetylcysteine, which will convert to glutathione in the liver, assuming you have a healthy liver, because not all affected children have healthy livers. So, but you cannot really go wrong. I suppose if you take too much of anything, it'll give you heartburn, but which is not pleasant. But someone is saying thank you, and you're welcome. Knowing that you can never gain back the years, can high-functioning young teen be helped? Absolutely, and I think every effort should be made to take children that are close to the finish line, to move them across the finish line. That they deserve to get the full court 9 yards pedal to the metal treatment as much as a child who's apraxic, who's 5 years old, because that teen, being able to socially interact appropriately with people and maybe gaining a few IQ points is the difference between being on food stamps and holding down a job. I realize there aren't a lot of jobs out there right now, but you know what I'm talking about. And so absolutely, if someone is near the finish line, and I have met some brilliant high-functioning teens that cannot hold down jobs and they're going to have to live with their moms for the next 50 years. But if they receive the appropriate interventions, there's a real chance that they can become self-sustaining, because as parents, we cannot live forever. How can I know for sure that my son has leaky gut? Well, you look at these biomarkers of intestinal permeability. That's what I've been talking about. He sees a pediatrician. Oh, that's a mistake usually. Who knows a little about environment but does not test for this. All he goes by is my son's food sensitivities and behaviors. Okay, so this is an example of knowing a little but not knowing a lot. And some even pediatricians are waking up, but this is an area that there's so much to know. It has taken me years of being involved in treating brain injured and autistic children to be able to give you this talk, and I probably didn't give it very well because, organic chemistry and biochemistry was not my strong suit in college and medical school, and had I known I was going to need it as much as I probably would have studied a little harder. But once you go out in the real world and you're a practicing pediatrician or a physician of any kind, you do not want to have to put the self-starter effort into learning something that is not being supported by conventional medicine, that is not being supported by your colleagues. You do not run into a room where you're going to be labeled a fringe, kooky physician. Okay? You just don't do it. That's not the way physicians think. So it's tough to find somebody who really knows the big picture. Okay, what is the question here? This is a long question. It's still the same question. All he goes, which confuses me. He doesn't. Sorry for mumbling. What do you recommend for treatment of anxiety? Many children, of course, their body is having tremendous anxiety because it's malfunctioning. So their bodies are innately anxious, and not surprisingly, many children have low oxytocin levels. So I will often use the hormone oxytocin to supplement them, because that blocks anxiety inputs into the limbic or emotional centers of the brain, and it's harmless. I wouldn't give it to a pregnant woman because it'll cause uterine contractions, but other than that, giving a child oxytocin is a harmless way of decreasing their anxieties, and many children respond to it. You'll have to get that from a compounding pharmacy, and it requires a physician's prescription. But it's one of the things I use to wean children off of risperidol that they've been placed on tragically. My friend has Parkinson's disease. Would glutathione help? Absolutely. So many Parkinson's disease patients respond to getting glutathione. Not everybody, but so many do. And Parkinson's disease has been which does respond to hyperbaric oxygen as well, has been implicated in old traumatic brain injuries as well as environmental poisonings. So, you know, when you look at adults, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, these are potentially people, had they been born in the last few years, we would now be calling inappropriately autistic. So we could be looking at the same subset of the population who are manifesting Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. They have the exact same problem the children with autism have. If oxygen causes oxidative stress, how does hyperbaric oxygen make things better? Because at the pressures that we use, the 1.5 atmospheres, anything under 2 atmospheres, you get a paradoxical decrease in oxidative stress because hyperbaric oxygen upregulates the enzymes that protect against oxidative stress. And you have to also remember that the greatest source of reactive oxygen species is in the mitochondria itself, in that electron transport chain reaction. And if that reaction starts to malfunction, you're going to have more oxidative stress. So what hyperbaric oxygen therapy does is it revives the mitochondria. It heals the mitochondria, and so you have more glutathione. You have the ability to protect that mitochondria from its innately caused oxidative stress. If I have 2 boys with quote-unquote autism, thank you for using quotes around that, you get it, 6 and 4 years old. They are being worked up for mitochondrial disease by Dr. Fry and consulting with Dr. Gupta for primary immune dysfunction. How can IVIG help with mitochondrial urea cycle issues and specific antibody deficiency? Okay, I think IVIG, which is not the answer for everybody, I think IVIG comes to the fore in children who are having inappropriate autoimmunity issues. And what do I mean by that? I think when you infuse the body with intravenous gamma globulin, you are providing feedback to the body that it doesn't need to make its own immunoglobulin. There's plenty of immunoglobulin present in the body, and this is just one mechanism, and it's something I came up with here. So your immunoglobulin that's been attacking your neurons and causing inflammatory reactions quiets down because all this IVIG comes into the body, and there's a sort of negative feedback loop. Now, I think that's a very expensive way of doing something that hyperbaric oxygen does better, and it also doesn't address the underlying issues in terms of ridding the body of viral infections that should be treated, or making sure there's no yeast overgrowth. So it's a clue, it's a piece of the puzzle. I don't think it's an effective treatment, one of the major keystone effective treatments. But that's the mechanism that I understand what's going on. You just spoke of when they have been detoxed. Do you mean chelated? Well, I use the word detoxification because instead of chelation all the time, because detoxification is a little different than chelation. Giving extra glutathione is not chelation, even though glutathione is the way the body protects itself against oxidation, and is certainly part of the body's detoxification kinetic system. And even if you're taking something like DMPS or DMSA, those really aren't chelators from a chemistry point of view. They're coaxers. Now, OSR, which we talked about earlier, is actually a true chemical chelator from a chemistry point of view, where it wraps itself around the mercury, the lead, and the arsenic, and pulls it out of the body in a protected state. Okay, someone was giving me their email address. My question is about oxalate. Previously, I've been low to no oxalate for over 2 years, and I'm not healthy. Lucifer, thank you. I have to sign off. Okay. What can be done about the inability of my 5-year-old to speak? Well, you find one of the doctors who are at the leading edge of treating affected children, and we do our best. We do some of the things I've talked about here in this presentation. I heard burn victims deplete their glutathione in addition to hyperbaric oxygen for healing. Would glutathione IV also be a good idea for treating burns? Absolutely. How would DHA and GABA, how much DHA and GABA is recommended? That depends, because not all children respond to getting extra gamma aminobutyric acid. That has to be on a case-by-case basis. For the vast majority of children, omega-3 essential fatty acids and DHEA are very important and very helpful, and you truly can't have too much. Of course, you take too, within reason, certainly 3 to 6 grams, depending on the size of the child, if they can tolerate that, would not necessarily be too much. What causes a child to be allergic to magnesium? I would question that they were allergic to magnesium. They might be allergic in something in the magnesium mixture you're using, or the type of something going with the magnesium. There are many types of. There's magnesium chloride. There's magnesium citrate. There's magnesium sulfate, and some kids cannot do too much sulfurs, so they have issues with transsulfuration. So. That's too vague a question. I don't think anyone has a magnesium allergy. Is there any order in which certain supplements should be given to use? Well, the answer is probably yes, and it probably depends on an individual case, so there's no way to give a global answer for that question. Okay, someone said he's been, if someone has been getting, I just want to say, I guess we're going back to hyperbaric oxygen therapy. If one has been getting biomedical intervention and been getting it for 3 years, as someone has, and you've made good progress, absolutely you can start hyperbaric oxygen. Is having a highly elevated level of natural killer cells an indicator? If so, what they can do? My son's NK cells are twice that of actually, having a lot of NK killer cells, I understand to be a good thing, not a bad thing. What does that mean? That means something is stimulating them, and so I would question whether that child has a chronic smoldering viral infection. Let them know that when the ENBER-8 study is registered with the IRB, all his treatment and diagnostic tests will be available from member physicians. Okay, so my executive director wants me to tell everyone that we are planning a translational medicine study with many of these interventions. And the protocols will be, the protocol, once it's been established, will be available to member physicians, and they can become part, even if they're in private practice, especially if they're in private practice, they can become part of an IRB-approved translational medical study, and hopefully that'll be going no later than next year. Wait a minute, I'm skipping a question here. Hold on. Is lead chelation with EDTA a good thing to do, and should it be done simultaneously with other treatments? And the answer is probably yes. Again, no sweeping generalizations. No, I cannot recommend a dosage per se at this time. Please review when to use hydroxy versus methylcobalamin. We're talking about supplementing B12, which is important in the methylation cycle. And You want to give the biologically active form of B12, but if someone has a catechol-methyltransferase double mutation, it's probably safer to give hydroxy B12 so as not to add to the burden of methyl groups to have to deal with. Can C-reactive protein fluctuate considerably? I think a lot of biomarkers can fluctuate, but I am not aware of C-reactive protein being prone to aberrant and unexplained fluctuations. There's usually a reason for C-reactive protein to be up at one time and not at another. Hope that answered your question. And yes, IVIG and HBOT can be used at the same time, but I don't think you have to be using IVIG if you're using HBOT. Much more cost effective. Can you redisplay the slide of the tests you were talking about? Okay, so I'm going to back up a little from the supplements. Or supplements. Go up, 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 up. Yes, okay, hold on. Here we go. Okay. And talk about how they are interpreted. What role do you see for retroviruses? I read the pig retrovirus contaminated some vaccines. Retroviruses have the ability to directly harm mitochondria, right? Is this something you've looked at? Well, it's very interesting that the NIH, the CDC, the FDA, they all know, excuse me, they all know that all vaccines that are derived from eggs, including MMR and the flu vaccine, have avian leukosis virus, a retrovirus that is in the avian population, the bird population. Also contaminated in these vaccines are reverse transcriptase. So every so often you will have someone getting these vaccines who will have the DNA from these cancer-causing viruses written into the cells of their own DNA. Not the mitochondrial DNA per se, but the chromosomal DNA. At 10, 20, 30 years down the road, yes, they will get cancer, which sort of makes a joke of our current method of vaccine testing, where we give the vaccine to people who aren't even age appropriate to the down population that will end up getting those vaccines. And we watch them for 2 weeks to make sure nobody died. No, nobody died. 2 weeks, this vaccine is safe. No, it's not. But that's what we're dealing with. That's what passes as safety studies with the FDA, who's a trade arm of the big pharmaceutical companies, who have total immunity over any harm that they can cause. FYI, the reason environmental medical treatment has not become more known is because our medical model is based on infectious disease that puts things like antibiotics and vaccines in, while assuming that the body is just detoxifies itself without help. Is that part of what is wrong with the system and paradigms medicine operates under? Yeah, you know, environmental medicine is not taught in medical school. So I remember getting very angry as a second-year medical student, looking at all the histopathology of cirrhosis and liver disease, and nothing was being taught to me on how did that patient's liver get to be that way. What was that patient exposed to? Was he an alcoholic? How do you treat alcoholics? Was there some other environmental toxin that caused his liver to turn that way? That's what I wanted to learn. I didn't want to learn how to identify hepatocytes from one disease state to another. I wanted to learn what was, on a macro level, how did the liver become diseased? How can we prevent that from happening? And how can we treat that patient? That's what I wanted to learn. That was not taught in medical school. Again, medical education controlled by the pharmaceutical companies. Environmental medicine, not taught in medical school. And when you graduate, if you didn't learn it in medical school, you just are not open to learning about it. You don't have the time. You've been molded. You've been cast like a clay pot put in the furnace. You've been fired up. Now you're hardened. You're hardened and your mind is closed. Because there's something that happens in medical school. You are so overwhelmed by how much information is out there. You either stay in that overwhelmed state and say, you know what, I'm just going to be brave and courageous and do my best and learn as much as I can. Or you suddenly switch and say, I'm going to pretend I actually know everything, even though I don't know everything. Well, most medical students do the latter, not the former. As a defense mechanism, they pretend they know everything. And it decreases their stress because it's very stressful not to know everything you realize you need to know. And you do things to reduce your stress. So most of the doctors out there, the way they think is, hey, if this worked, I know about it. That's where they get that from. Okay. Trying to make sense of the question. Someone's asking me something very patient specific, so I'm going to skip that. My son is 4 and has been on biomedical treatment for over 2 years. He's currently doing HBOT in the hard chamber. Before we started, we did a 6-week course of antifungals. He's very stimmy, hyper, needs a lot of pressure, non-compliant at times during therapy. Is that a common side effect of there is something going on. Either there's something going on that's not being addressed, and without knowing the particulars of your son's case, stimming is a reflection of body anxiety, of a metabolic pathway that is not functioning appropriately. So something has not been addressed. My son had a complete metabolic panel that showed it was working okay. The metabolic panels that the general metabolic panels that are done at commercial labs do not reflect any of these biomarkers that I've been talking about. So what can be the cause of my son's sensitivity to chemical additives? What could be the problem, and what other? Okay, well, as you're looking at this slide now, there is a lot of tests that don't get run by most physicians. And so when people say metabolic panel, that usually refers to the commercially available metabolic panels that don't look at any of what you're looking at. Well, thyroid gets addressed, cholesterol gets addressed, but all these other things, CBC, but most of the rest do not get addressed. So these other esoteric panels need to be done too. What labs do you recommend for the porphyrin test? The French lab, Great Plains, and LabCorp, and that's about it. I wouldn't do the porphyrin test at any other lab. I'm sure I'm going to make somebody mad saying that. Are malformed fingernail toenails common in this disorder? If so, why? I don't know if anyone's looked at that, and certainly malformed toenails and fingernails directly speak about issues often having to do with the body's ability to get oxygen or use oxygen appropriately. My son's IgG are very high. Can you comment on reason? Yes, because he's being exposed to things he's allergic to. Every doctor uses Quest for my son's test. I cannot afford right now to get the test done myself. What can I do in the meantime? Oh, I wish I had an answer for that question. My son has so much mucus. He blows his mouth, mucus coming up through his mouth many times a day. What could be any reasons for this? His immune system is not working properly. That is what's generating the inflamed mucous membranes, the huge amounts of mucus production, it is your indication that his immune system is upset, and that its normal function has been compromised, and it's a non-trivial issue. What do you think causes folate receptor binding antibodies? Both of my children have this. Well, remember, I talked about earlier how the vaccines cause an encephalitis and an autoimmune problem. Well, those antibodies go and attack the brain cells. And when they attack the brain cells, they're also attacking the receptors on those brain cells. And folate receptors are some of those, are on those brain cells. So you have people who have NMDA receptor antibodies. You have people who have oxytocin antibodies and folate antibodies. It's just one of the many class of antibodies that you find in children who are having these encephalitic syndromes caused often by the vaccine reactions. I am concerned about potassium bromate in the food supply and lack of dietary iodine. Can bromide toxicity and dietary iodine deficiency affect mitochondrial function? You've just asked a question that is actually above my knowledge base, but I'm going to look it up now. Thank you very much. You stopped reading my question. Sorry, continue, confusing. Signs of leaky gut. Usually the signs of leaky gut have to do with inflammation issues, allergies, and inappropriate behaviors coming from the substances that are causing the leaky gut. Is hyperbaric oxygen up-regulating the IDO enzyme? I'm not familiar with that enzyme that increases inflammation. I'm not sure. Are leaky gut and yeast overgrowth the same? Not the same, but obviously associated problems. Also, can children still have food sensitivities and not have yeast overgrowth and leaky gut? I suppose it's possible, but for sure, if you have leaky gut, you'll have food issues. What are your thoughts on glutathione and liposomal-based transdermal delivery system? I have used a product like this called Oxidase by Apex. I think the liposomal delivery system is very good for several different types of substances. So it's one of the ways of getting things past your stomach that can get destroyed by the stomach. And of course, using biomarkers is one of the ways of determining whether your interventions are actually working. At what age would you use DMSA, or does it depend on the health of the child? You know, if you have a child that has a severe metal toxicity issue, you have to start using something. DMSA is FDA approved for treating lead toxicity. It doesn't mean everyone can tolerate it. A lot of the agents that have high sulfur content will affect yeast growth issues, so it's a non-trivial matter of starting these agents if you aren't doing something to prevent yeast overgrowth. I don't think age per se is a determining factor as much as are we dealing with the severity of the toxicity. So would I say a 3-month-old that has just been poisoned by lead is too young to receive DMSA? No. But obviously treating a 3-month-old may be a little more involved than treating a 30-year-old. What is indicated by a sensitivity to chromium? Sensitivity to chromium. I'm not sure what you mean by sensitivity to chromium. And let's see here. Chromium. I'm looking it up. That's what I have to do sometimes. Look things up. Increases insulin sensitivity via potentiating insulin receptor activity. Sugar metabolism improved by 80% in those with slight glucose intolerance. Aids in lowering LDL and raising HDL. Trivalent chromium is used in biological systems and largely non-toxic. Hexavalent chromium is found in industry and highly toxic. I'm seeing pictures of Julia Roberts flash through my mind for some reason. Is using magnesium stearate. What does this mean? It means you still should. It is usually magnesium stearate that he cannot tolerate. What does that mean? It means he shouldn't be on magnesium stearate. Have you tried another form of magnesium? Are autistic children often deficient in Mitochondrial Cycle, aka Intestinal Cycle? I'd have to look that up. I'm not currently aware of that being an issue. That doesn't mean it isn't. Does zinc chloride really pull mercury out of the system? I have never heard that. I was told this by the company that makes it when I called to find out if it was making my son hyper after taking it. Okay, stop taking it. Is there any order in which certain supplements should be given to prevent interference? That sounds like a repeat question. The answer is yes, but it's a very individualized thing, so I can't make any global recommendations. My son's serum levels shows a very high B12 levels without him taking methyl B12. Okay, important point. One can have normal vitamin B levels and yet not be utilizing them because the metabolic pathways are not working. So the fact that one's vitamin B levels are normal does not mean one should not receive or benefit from therapeutic vitamin Bs. Okay. What type of workup for GI issues do you recommend? Well, you start with the organic acid test because it's so easy to do. The organic acid test done by labs like Great Plains, not LabCorp, Quest, or Tricor. Okay, they do not look at some of the metabolites from bacteria and fungus that can be obtained by looking at different organic acids that are not available at commercial labs. So an first morning urine organic acid test is a real quick and easy way of determining issues that are going on in the gut. In your experience, what does puffy black circles under the eyes indicate? Usually that's an indication of stress, lack of sleep, too much sugar, a chronic infection, poisoning, you name it. What can be done to remedy low Sig-A? Oh gosh, I don't even know what Sig-A is. See, I don't know everything, and I've been doing this for years. When IgG levels show improvement for food sensitivities, what are your thoughts on reintroductions of previously restricted foods such as gluten? What about the Feingold diet, foods such as dyes, red foods? Well, I think processed foods are bad, period. So the more you stay away from processed foods that have all these weird chemicals in them, the better. And if your IgG levels drop, as they will drop if you stay away from foods you were previously sensitive to, and the gut has been healed, you can reintroduce foods. That is a truth. But the gut has to be healed. So if the gut's still not healed, the IgG levels will drop, but that doesn't mean you should be reintroducing those foods. Can a strep throat test be done at Quest? I don't know the answer to that. Have you had any experience with Respin A, and if so, do you think it can help any of these conditions? I use oxytocin nasal spray in my practice, and because oxytocin nasal spray does the things that Respin A does, I have never gravitated to experimenting with it or using it. So I know oxytocin works, and I stay with it, and I know it's harmless, and so that's why I can't comment on Respin A. Can probiotics be rotated? I recommend often that they be rotated. I recommend that you don't use the same brand all the time, that maybe you give one brand in the morning and another brand in the afternoon and another brand in the evening. My son always develops a sensitivity to these when taken for any amount of time. Well, then all the more reason to rotate them. Do you feel all kids need GFCF, or is CF, or maybe depending on the Weston Price SCD diet? It is a truth that not everyone is equally sensitive to casein or gluten. I think gluten. Well, you know, I'm not gonna even go there. There are kids who are just gluten sensitive. There are kids who are just casein sensitive, and there are kids who are some of each. You have to find out. That's why you do these biomarkers. My son's level of antimony showed much higher than other levels, such as lead and mercury. What can you say about antimony? Antimony is bad news. It's what causes crib death, because it's one of the chemicals that get released from the plasticides that are being deteriorated by fungus in the plastic crib mattresses. That's why they recommend that the child sleep on their back, so their nose isn't buried into the plasticide mattress, where there's heavier than air elements that are toxic. Of course, they don't tell you that because they don't know that's the reason, because the information that these poisons are being released by the fungal breakdown of the plasticides and fire retardants in these mattresses is the cause of crib death. They want to keep that secret so there aren't lawsuits. But do not use a plastic crib mattress if you can, and if you do, you need to wrap it with a special wrapping. But it's better to sleep on an organic, for the baby to sleep on an organic mattress. And of course, antimony is in fire retardants, so boy, when you buy clothes for kids at the store, you need to wash them like 3 times, unless you already know they're organic, to get the fire retardant out of them. My son is allergic to mold, so he has trouble with plant-based enzymes. He also had trouble with the pork-based ones. What other options are there? Do all children with yeast overgrowth have leaky gut and need them? First of all, if a child has problems with any supplement, that needs to be looked at as to what the reason is. I'm not sure the reason you've been given is the actual reason, but those who have yeast overgrowth often have a biofilm, and the process of destroying that biofilm often requires enzymes. EDTA, which is one of the quote-unquote chelators, can help also destroy the biofilm because it pulls out certain metals that the biofilm uses to hold itself together. So there are potential ways of, like using EDTA, doing it without enzymes, but I'm wondering if the reason you've been given for the problem with the enzymes is the actual reason. Oh, gosh. How do you feel about muscle testing for food and other intolerances? I like muscle testing to get quick answers, but I don't hang my hat on muscle testing because we can, for example, if you go into an office and the alternative practitioner muscle tests for, does this child have food sensitivities, yes or no? It's a quick answer for running these tests. When there are objective tests that can be run, these biomarkers, the purpose of muscle testing needs to gravitate to another area. If a child comes in with a strep throat and you can do a quickie strep test, I think that strep test is more appropriate than muscle testing, just because it's an objective test. And I support alternative ways of diagnosing, and I support the body's intuition and that the body can tell you things, but I think we're dealing with a very serious problem, and where the prevailing paradigm doesn't even believe this is a medical problem, and we need to treat it as a medical problem, which means doing all the appropriate medical tests we can. SIG-A is secretory immunoglobulin A. Thank you. What have you heard of using food-grade diatomaceous earth mixed in yogurt for removing intestinal candida, biofilms? I think diatomaceous earth can help some people. I don't have a lot of experience in giving diatomaceous earth, but it is definitely an area that has potential for some children. My 5-year-old son's stool tests repeatedly show blastocystis hominis. I added that part myself. His oat organic acid test markers are normal for fungi, but shows high bacterial dysbiosis. His CD, shows up with a range, candida, Klebsiella pneumonia, but again, his blastocystis, yes, this is getting very patient-specific. But it's from Bangladesh. Hello, Bangladesh, you're still up. That's a hard bug to get rid of, you know, even if you use multiple antibiotics, it's a hard bug to get rid of. And I think ultimately the best answer for dysbiosis is going to be an adequate supply of very potent and powerful probiotics that can help crowd out some of these pathological organisms. And I wish I had a better answer for you than that, but that's the answer I'm giving today. Lab done on child plasma amino acids was elevated. Citrulline. Oh, we're going through the whole amino acid diagnosis. What does this mean? It can be done. What can be done? I'm going to pass on that question because I'm going to have to look up those amino acids, and I don't want to take the time up to do that because I don't have that on the tip of my brain. I always have to look up what amino acids, and you know what are, you know, so, oh, well, let me just read this last question. So basically, if you don't have the money and your insurance won't cover these levels, you are just out of luck. Isn't there anything I can do for my son? I just met with Louis Vismara, who's the policy advisor of the Senate Pro Tem in the state of California. And, you know, most of the kids in California who have autism are on Medi-Cal. That just had like $600 million cut from its budget. And I tried to suggest some things, and he just put his hands up and said, what would you have us cut? They do not want to spend money on anything right now. This is a tragedy. I'm sorry. I get this all the time. I give away consultations all the time, but the parents don't have money to do tests. Some parents don't have money to make the adjustments to even go on a GFCF diet. This is a big sociological, societal problem because these kids are, we're going to have to pay for these kids. They're going to go into institutions. Their homes going to need to be built for them. This is going to cost money. This is going to bankrupt the Treasury if we do not do something about this now and curtail the poisons, the exposure to the poisons that are killing us. So I do not have a good answer for you. I just don't, and I'm sorry about that. All right, I'm going to wrap up this this webinar that's gone on for almost 2.5 hours, and thank you for joining me. And we're going to put the slides up at the Great Plains website, the New Hopes Clinic website, and the website of the International Hyperbaric Medical Foundation. And all right, thank you for joining us. Before you can leave, you must choose another organizer to run the webinar in your absence. Otherwise, you must end the webinar for all. There we go.